Welcome, everybody. I'm Ivo Dollar, the president of the council. Tonight, I'm very pleased to welcome the members of the Emerging Leaders Class of 2014 here today. This is a special event for them, but it is actually also a special event for all of us because we're going to be discussing the report that the class of 2014 has been putting together. Also want to thank John Livingston, who will help us in putting this all in perspective, and particularly I want to at this point thank our two vice chairs, who happen to also be the co-chairs of the Emerging Leadership Program, Shirley Welsh-Ryan and John Manley, who have been the brains and inspiration behind this for so many years, and the great supporters of the Emerging Leadership Program. The selection committee, which has been so supportive of trying to put together each year a remarkable class, I want to thank them too: Duck Deutsch, Michael Werner, Linda Wolf, Don Cook, and Marilyn Diamond. Thank you for your support of this effort. We're coming to the end of our programming season at the council. We will end on June 26. You will shortly hear from us that the Vice President will be here to deliver a speech on foreign policy on June 26th. That will be our last public program of the year. You have a copy of the report on your seats, as well as on the outside, that we're going to discuss. I'm very eager to learn more about big data in large global cities. But before we hear from you, let me welcome to the stage Shirley Welsh-Ryan for her introductory remarks. And she will introduce the panel, and then the panel will present the report. Shirley is a long-standing member, very long-standing member of the council, has been an extraordinary supporter of what we in the council are doing, as not only as vice chairman, but for many years, in many ways, supporting the programs that we have here. She is, as I said, the co-chair of the Emerging Leadership Program, and I'm extremely pleased that Shirley Welsh-Ryan will be able to introduce this class. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivo. It is an honor to be able to do this, and a very distinguished panel. And I'll tell you two things that you may not have known prior, but probably assumed. And number one, the Chicago Council, which I've been a member of since, are you ready? Since I was 23. I think John Manley may have started around that, but at a different state, a different point in life. He started very, very, very early also. We genuinely believe in the value of the Chicago Council in providing some of the roots and the ingredients for a democracy, for a vibrant democracy, and a democracy in which the public understands what's going on. And I would say there are two things. One, the Chicago Council, in all the years I've been a member and later a director, has been very transparent. As we know, Sarbanes-Oxley kind of brought that as a formula to the for-profit sector, but the not-for-profit sector varied in on its understanding of transparency. And the Chicago Council has had transparency, remarkable stewardship of its financial books, and that has been true all the way through. It's very important because as emerging leaders, and more than that, as leaders today, as young leaders in Chicago and in this country, in the world, you are going to find that there are ways in which you will want to make a difference. We feel strongly about the importance of this for Chicago. Remember, number two, that the Chicago Council, young professionals, and other parts of the Chicago Council are entirely privately funded or publicly funded by foundations that feel strongly about the importance of global understanding in our society and in our city. And those are the two things that I want to clarify, because in effect, we all have an obligation to be able to help others. And not only to help others, but also to make a difference in our city and our civic fiber. So I remind you of this. You are people who will have enormous access to capital, one way or the other. You may choose to put it in your own foundations, you may choose to put it in your own families, and you may choose to be participant in your own corporate, not-for-profit, and for-profit worlds. It is important to foster this type of roots of our democracy. We are the Manleys and the Ryans, Mary and John and Pat and I are very proud of our participation with the Chicago Council and the emerging leaders. And presenting the report tonight, and it's, what a topic, wow. Thank you for doing this topic. Global cities and big data, it's where it's at. All that algorithm, all that remarkable access to connecting us. Thank you. And the first, John Livingston, who was just mentioned by our wonderful Evo, is a director at McKinsey and Company. Lincoln Ellis, who is the managing director of Green Square Capital. Caralynn Nowinski is the executive director and chief operating officer of UI Labs. And I might add, we have all read a lot about how much we are placing in the future of that remarkable background. Thank you. And Nirav Shah, right? Nirav. I want to say it, Nirav Shah. Thank you, Nirav. I apologize, I don't. And Nirav, we have not officially met. I've only read, remember, all of us on the committee have probably read everything about every emerging leader in all of the 7 classes, at least 15 hours, in all types of levels of determination as to who will be in the class. And I've only read your name 100 times. And is an associate at Sidley Austin. And Ted Souder is head of the industry retail group at Google. So we're really proud. Thank you very much for being here.
Good evening, I'm Lincoln Ellis. Evo, thank you very much for now. This is the 6th year running. Your and the Council's continued support for what we've done. Shirley and John, thank you again, and to the McCormick Foundation for the continued support. We couldn't do it without that. And of course, to our internal shepherds and Sherpas, Molly O'Donnell and Rachel Bronson, thank you very much. Tonight's the culmination of 2 years of extraordinary relationship building and really an insightful, very helpful program. Thank you very much. Let me kick off this evening with just a brief overview of our work, pointing up first that our cohort in the 2014 class contains, in fact, 0 data scientists. I think that Ted and Caralynn are probably the closest headline experts, and while we're privileged to have John Livingston join us this evening, who actually is an expert, the bulk of our inquiry and work was done exclusively by a group of just interested citizens. The explosion of big data availability coincides neatly with the growing constraints on public resources at a time when more and more of the globe's population is migrating into urban environments. The confluence of this, unimaginable a mere 25 years ago, produces a potentially useful set of synergies, which can allow municipalities, perhaps, to do more with less. And do more with less we must. Recent employment numbers clearly illustrate that during the current administration is the only time over the past 25 years when the numerical size of bodies inhabiting the public sector actually shrank. This is an observational fact, not a partisan jab, and yet one that gets to the core of why the work around big data and municipal governance is so important. Most of the losses in public sector employment are at the state and local levels, and most of the concurrent loss in services provided hits those whose jobs have been lost. This is not a partisan problem, this is a community challenge. Unfortunately, resource constraints are a consistent feature of the post-crisis global landscape. Happily, though, is the renaissance in productivity gains garnered by our ability to leverage technology and information to achieve smarter ends and course correct in more efficient and effective fashions. These are the ideas that have animated the 2014 Emerging Leaders class of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs to undertake a survey of Chicago's role in developing best practices in the collection, aggregation, and use of big data in the service of municipal governance. While by no means exhaustive, our goal is more to highlight the way in which Chicago has been a leader in the adoption and potential use of big data to help drive a city to be smarter and a more efficient engine of growth for its residents. Why Chicago? Surprisingly, we're the only developed market city slated to grow into a megacity by 2025. And with a population of more than 10 million people, moving from our current levels to those forecast will no doubt give those at City Hall a series of very steep challenges, in addition to those they already face. As Ted, Caralynn, Nirav, and John will discuss, we chose 4 pillars that we believe drive the most meaningful impact. First, energy. Conservation is only part of the equation here. Indeed, as more people migrate into urban environments and as we continue to push out much needed reinvestment in urban energy infrastructure, big data tells us that we can and will need to be smarter about how and where we go about reinventing our grids and operationalizing the next wave of energy sourcing. The sustainability of our cities and our lives depend on this. Secondly, transportation. While of course it's nice to know when the bus or train is coming, especially in the winter like the one we had just now, the real nugget of gold in the transportation sector sits in our ability to sort, sift, and analyze how we use our public transportation infrastructure, the second largest in the country, and therefore how and where we might make improvements. Third, education. As any parent knows, test scores give us only part of the picture. Rapid analysis of multiple data sets is needed to understand the drivers, make meaningful and timely adjustments, and thereby address critical gaps in school and student performance, student safety, and job preparedness. Through public and private partnerships, Chicago has leveraged the academic, business, and nonprofit communities to provide data-driven solutions and improve educational outcomes. However, we continue to sit at the bottom of the table in this critical public deliverable. More should and can be done in a more efficient and effective way. And finally, public safety. Facing a recent surge in violent crimes, Chicago is employing big data to better coordinate responses, provide social services, understand the criminal landscape, and quantify outcomes. Additionally, tremendous strain on the system results from the influx of new residents into a city. This strain can cause increase in potential for crime, the cost of crime prevention and enforcement, as city budgets decline. Big data has helped law enforcement create social networks that identify individuals who are more likely to be crime victims and thus allow for better targeting and prevention strategies. Together, these make up the core deliverables of any municipal government. We've gone one step further, and I'll conclude on this, with 7 ideas that make up a matrix for municipal governance and big data. 1, lead data initiatives from the top, and we in Chicago are doing that. 2, collect appropriate and quality data. Especially on the quality side, this remains a very important issue. 3, to ensure data sharing, public access, and collaboration. Surprisingly, intergovernmental cooperation is sorely lacking here. 4, put safeguards in place for data security. I have in my notes here, Snowden. Address privacy concerns. Again, Snowden. 6, gain public support. Don't treat this as inevitable. It's very important for us to have municipal buy-in. And 7th, and finally, fund outcome-based evidence that works. As our now past friend from the South Side once said, it's a mistake to judge policies and programs on their intentions rather than their results. While big data can help, the policy and governance decisions are ultimately ones that are made between people like all of us gathered in this room. The promise of data is that together we can be smarter, more efficient, and more effective. I'll now turn it over to my colleague, Ted Souder.
Thank you. So before we get underway, I just wanted to get a sense from the audience, before this evening, how many of you were aware of the topic of big data? I'm going to go with maybe like half, maybe a little bit more. So good. So we have maybe some education to do tonight, some replay for those of you guys who are very familiar. But the idea around big data isn't incredibly new, but it's very, very buzzy today. There's lots of talk about it. There's reports being developed about it, these great things. But I wanted to ask John the first question. Is big data, is it a fad, or is this the new normal?
So I think as we use the term big data, and I would just be a bit careful not to forget about the little data too. We can get overwhelmed with, it's big data. What does that mean? Where does the line between little and big come? The reality is that most of the time, there is a bunch of data available that one might refer to as little data that we aren't using to its full. And so we get buzzy about, okay, what are we going to do with all the cell phone sensor data and all these pictures that people are taking? Okay, great. But you don't even know today how much electricity your home is using. So, before we have to get all fancy, let's just get some of the basics done around little data. And then, as we build on that, obviously there's data to come. I think this is not a fad, in the sense that data analytics, eventually going from little to bigger and bigger and bigger data, has been with us, frankly, for 40 years, right? It's an evolution of analytics attached to data sets. The great thing now is that we have a set of analytical tools that allow us to leverage greater and greater sizes of data that allows us to draw implications that we might not have been able to draw before. So we can put data together in ways we hadn't thought of before, and new data is being created all the time. So one of my favorites is the University of Vermont did I think I'm going to get this phrase right, built a hedanometer to understand how happy we are across the country. And the way they did this...
That's so Vermont.
Yes, it's so Vermont, exactly. The way they did this was they took Twitter feeds, and they determined what words, when used in a Twitter feed, indicate happiness or sadness, etc. And then they mapped this across the country, by city, you could take it down as far as you want to go. They did it by any data they could get about the people involved in sending those tweets. The fascinating thing is Chicago, it turns out, has a hedonic indicator of 5.98. The happiest city in the United States is Napa, California. Surprise, surprise. And the happiest state, can anybody guess the happiest state? Colorado. Hawaii, of course, the happiest state at 6.25. So, okay, what difference does that make? Well, the point is that they took data that didn't exist before, and then they figured out a way to put it together and interpret it in a way you wouldn't have thought of, with using words and how do words tie back to feelings, and then now, someone can interpret that data in lots of different ways. But these data sets that are now there in the analytical toolkits allow us to do things we never would have thought possible before, if we have the right set of interpretation skills of what do you want to do with that happiness index. And are we good at 5.98, or do we want to do something as a municipality to try and edge up our hedonistic index or something? But anyway, short answer is, this isn't a fad.
I like that. Nirav, hedonometers aside, how has big data impacted you here in Chicago?
Well, there are multiple levels on which big data operates. Some of them are seen by all of us. Some of them are unseen. In the seen, we talk about things like the bus trackers that help you make sure you catch your train and your bus. And those are great, and they have a nice gee whiz quality to them. But arguably, the bigger impact from big data a city and citizen level comes in the areas that we don't even see. For example, the Chicago Police Department has been really at the vanguard in using big data coupling that big data with various arrest records and social networks to identify not just who's being arrested, but who might actually be at risk for violence, either as a perpetrator or as a victim. And this is all going on beneath the surface, and it's a tremendous way to harness what John mentioned, all of these data sets that previously were discordant, and synthesize them into creating something new, and use that for the public good.
Fantastic. Caralynn, you are embarking on an incredibly exciting project with UI Labs, which will become the new normal as well.
I like the sound of that.
How is big data going to impact what you're doing in the future of manufacturing?
Well, thanks for the shout out, and thanks Shirley as well. So we are really excited about what UI Labs is doing in digital manufacturing, because there's so much data that's coming off of every part of manufacturing. Just like with any city operation, as we've learned in writing our report, data is coming off during the design phase and the make phase and the quality assurance, even in kind of end of life maintenance and recycling. And so how do we take all those trillions of data bits that are available, and there's a lot more that we're not even tracking that's also available, and how do we actually turn those data into information, and then that information into something that we can use to make decisions. And I think that brings back what John was saying in terms of we've got the tools today. So one of the reasons actually that UI Labs exists is because of the great research tools that we have in and around Chicago. We've got supercomputers at Argonne and at the University of Illinois that can actually, for the first time, take apart this data and make sense of it, figure out, amongst all these trillions of bits of data, which maybe thousands are important for making a particular decision. And we're seeing that in the industrial space and what we're doing at UI Labs in manufacturing. But I mean, that same analogy can be made to the city of Chicago and all the data that's coming off of every part of city operations.
John, Caralynn brings up a great point around there's so much data out there, but unless we're able to make sense of it and to analyze it and to use it, it's like it doesn't exist at all. One of the ways that we're going to get there is more investment in STEM education, locally and throughout the U.S. and throughout the world. Can you give us some thoughts on where STEM education, which is science, technology, engineering, and math, is being impacted by the growth in big data?
So I think there's both the how is it impacting STEM education in the sense of it's making it more and more important, because as we think about, take the manufacturing floor, the value add to that manufacturing floor more and more is going to require an understanding of how to use the data that comes out of those machines. And so I guess the requirement for STEM education has gone up. In addition, I think the analytical portion, the way that math gets applied in the business world, for instance, is changing. So the amount of statistics, et cetera, that you now need to be able to draw the conclusions is frankly just greater than it was before. And the link to computing power is also much important. So it's not good enough that you know math. If you can't figure out a way to make the computer do the math in the way you want it to, we have a problem too. So it's not just the theory of the case, but it's also then making it happen within whatever program you're working on. Let me just make one other point though, to not get too far down the road of STEM is the answer. So it is really critical that we have not just people who know math, but people who can think more broadly, because at the end of the day, the math is only going to be so good. At the end, you're going to have to take that math, that data, and draw conclusions. And so, everybody talks about Steve Jobs and how great he was. He didn't get great because he was a great engineer, right? Because he knew math. He had artistic knowledge and ability to draw inferences from different places. And so I don't think it's enough to say we just need STEM. We need well-rounded education so that people can draw the right set of conclusions from that information.
That's great. Great input. Nirav, when we were focusing as a group on cities, we were thinking, a lot happens in cities. Cities that you've talked a lot about on the radio earlier today, about how cities are one of the greatest innovations in the history of man. Can you talk a little bit about why cities are important for us to focus on?
Well, Ted, you're absolutely right. Cities are maybe next to double entry bookkeeping, the best thing that we've ever and maybe the cronut, the best thing that we've ever come up with as a civilization. And we've focused, our group opted to focus on cities for a couple of reasons. The first is just as a matter of human mass, that's where the people are. In 30 years, there are going to be as many people living in cities as currently live on the planet right now, over 6 billion people, just in cities. So in one level, that's where the people are, and as a result of that, that's where the problems are. But there's another element to cities that often goes unappreciated, which is that cities have this rigorous, pragmatic ethos about them that is uniquely focused on solving problems, right? I mean, Chicago's a great example of that. We are the city that works. And that's really what mayors and civic leaders bring to the table. It's not so much about ideology, it's about getting things done. And that's part of the reason we chose to focus on cities. And then there's a third, almost technical element, which is that we see that big data has the potential to be what's almost a second electrification of cities. Right? When cities received electricity in the earlier part of the last century, they radically transformed what it meant to be in a city. You couldn't have a tall building without an elevator. Right? You couldn't have a packed city center without trains to bring people there. You couldn't have high density without sewage pumps to get rid of all the waste. And that was all due to electricity. We see in big data the possibility to re-electrify cities in a new way. And we think that's tremendously important.
If I could just add one thing onto that, I mean, I think the point that Nirav made, specifically around local leaders, I mean, there's a real, direct correlation between the impact a local leader can have that is, distanced in DC or, even, in a capital environment. Mm-hmm. But in a city, you actually have a chance to be able to lead from the top. That's one of the takeaways that we found in our report as we looked at cities that were doing big data well and how they were utilizing big data, capturing that in their city and actually putting it to use in all sorts of creative ways. You needed that leadership from the top, in our case, and Mayor Emanuel saying that this is important and we're not going to necessarily be able to use all the data ourselves, but if we make it available and we put it out there, then we can see what other creative people, entrepreneurs, big business, civic hackers, there's plenty of groups out there that are then taking this data and figuring out ways to use it in unique, interesting ways that maybe wouldn't have been thought of if it wasn't just first and foremost made available.
Mm-hmm. John, are there other cities doing a great job of this? I mean, we've been very impressed with how Chicago has approached big data and been very open and had lots of great projects. Well, who else is doing this well?
So I think Chicago should get kudos for what has been done here over the last sort of 10 years in terms of opening up information, et cetera. New York, clearly, under Mayor Bloomberg, has done a lot in this area. Everything from building data sets around where the electricity grid is overused or underused in particular places to allow for essentially demand response in the right places, to predicting what drives fire in buildings. And they've figured out 60 different factors that can tell what kind of building is more likely to catch fire, and so therefore they've changed the way they do their fire inspections based on that. So I think New York is a standout. Singapore, where I lived for a few years, is a standout. Now everything in Singapore drives down to money at the bottom line. So they can tell you exactly how many people are going in and out of the city, and they'll charge you for that. So they've done very well, and that's definitely done from the top. So I think those two are different approaches, right? Bloomberg, I think, much more of the, hey, let's open this up and let people figure out and hack it and allow them to adopt a fire hydrant that they do in the wintertime. I think it's maybe it's in Boston, sorry, where they adopt fire hydrants. And in the wintertime when there's a snowstorm, it's your fire hydrant that you dig out. And then in Singapore, where it's much more top-down driven on pure economics and not a lot of community input. But I think Chicago is definitely one of the leaders in this right now.
I love that. In Boston, they decide to dig out fire hydrants, and in Chicago, you got to save your parking space, which is junk in the street. So there's different priorities.
There's business there somewhere. I don't know.
So let's dig into that for a minute, because I think this brings up a really interesting point. So in our report, as Lincoln mentioned, we were talking about energy, transportation, education, and public resources. All really, really important areas of focus. But we have limited resources. We have limited people. We have limited technology, and in many respects, we have limited cash. So how do we decide what to focus on? How do you balance public versus private focus there? Who pays for all of this? I'll throw this out to any of you.
Well, I'll just come in with one piece that I think John already alluded to. When you make data available, you have an opportunity to get it used cheaply. And yes, there is a requirement of investment just in being able to capture the data. Whether that means putting a sensor on a machine, or whether that means arming your bus with a new sensor, or your track of your train with a signal that's going to tell us where all our trains are at. So we can use Train Tracker, by the way. That's how that works. Read the report. You can find more about that. But there are constrained resources within cities, and so by leveraging open data in government, you've seen how New York and Chicago and others are able to find creative ways of making use of it. But the bridge between the private sector and the public sector in terms of public-private partnerships, and we've seen that in a number of relationships in our energy, transportation, public safety, and education. Actually, all four of those areas, we found evidence of public-private partnerships where you can leverage private investment and be able to determine that there is a return for industry, and there is an ROI that at the same time also has an ROI for the citizens of the city. So I think by continuing these trends and continuing the awareness building that these opportunities exist, that we'll have opportunities to use it even more. There's an example we talked about in a previous conversation about in Chicago. We have these grassroots efforts, things like on every Tuesday night at 1871, there's an Open Gov Hack Night where people are interested in this topic come and talk about how you might use data. That's a really cheap way for the city to get its data used. There's fellowships at the University of Chicago to figure out about using data science for social good. There's lots of grassroots movements in Chicago that we can capitalize on and then be able to better utilize our lack of resources.
Ted, if I could chime in really quickly, while I think it's critically important for any city or municipality to set spending priorities, that is in fact what an executive government needs to do, I want to sound a note of almost caution, which is that in setting those priorities, particularly with respect to big data, we found that there are certain risks that might come from governing by algorithm, if you will. An example might be an app in Boston that's called Street Bump, which makes use of the accelerometer on your smartphone and the fact that you're driving to determine when you've hit a pothole. And when you've done so, it sends a report up to the city, and in theory, the civic workers will come and fix it. It's a beautiful idea, but it raises fundamental questions about democracy and governance, which is to say, who's got a smartphone? Who's got a car? What neighborhoods are they driving in? Right? Whose big data are actually being captured for use? And if we're not being inclusive in that, our values will be compromised. There's also a second question related to that, which is, does everything that matters, can everything that matters be measured for purposes of big data? John started off by talking about the hedonometer. Well, I guess happiness now can be quantified, so that concern's off the table, but maybe there are other fundamental issues like justice, non-discrimination. How do we account for those? And I think it's important for city leaders to take those things into account.
So now that we've opened the privacy concern box, and also the reference to Snowden, of course, what are some of the big concerns around big data? I think the idea of the phone measuring the pothole bump through the accelerometer, sending that information to City Hall or wherever it may go, I think that that's fascinating. But yes, that does create all sorts of privacy concerns for people. Talk to us a little bit about the balance there of privacy and big data.
So there's two types of privacy that you can think of here. There's, or two types of security questions. First is privacy in the traditional consumer sense of I don't want my information being made available. The other is the security part of this, which is getting hacked into a industrial system, whether that be an electricity grid or a manufacturing plant or whatever. Let me focus a little on the second one first, because it's frankly the bigger long-term concern in this, in the sense of, or maybe better phrased, it's the thing that can blow this up. The more and more these networks become connected, the more at risk they are. And we sit here today not knowing how bad that risk really is, but you can get tunneling in from all sorts of places through wireless networks. So you think your, industrial manufacturing facility is just humming along and it's using natural gas as its, or coal or whatever. And oh, that network that uses my HR system, we would never. No, actually somewhere up there they can be very well connected. And so there's a big security risk here that's going to have to get solved, and it's not yet solved. And on the privacy side, our sense from looking at it is that over time, we as consumers become more and more and more comfortable with more and more of our information being shared. And it is a bit like the frog in the pot, right? You don't realize what you're sharing, and then you're sharing it, and then you don't realize what you're sharing it. All of a sudden the thing starts to boil and you're in real trouble. So far, over the last 20 years or so, we have chosen as a society to be willing to trade information for connectivity, for information or whatever, and that trend only seems to be accelerating based on the McKinsey research. And so our sense is that we will find ourselves 20 years from now still giving up more and more data because we're getting something in return for that.
Do you think that there's ever the situation where Facebook or Twitter or some of the newer apps that are all about anonymity, it's the shiny new thing. So everyone's taking advantage of it, everyone's sharing, oversharing, whatnot, but then they kind of realize, you know what, I don't want to be that public, and I'm gonna pull back a little bit. Does it lose its luster over time, and the privacy thing starts to diminish a little bit, or is that just crazy talk?
It very well could. So far the trends are showing none of that behavior yet.
Right.
In fact, it's only going the other direction so far. Now, anything can happen, but it's so far not.
Ted, with respect to privacy, from a policy perspective, one of the fundamental questions is whether there's anything new here, or on the other side, whether the biggest problem with privacy is the assumption that there's a really big problem with privacy. Thus far, from a policy perspective, there seems to be good reason to think that the existing legal regimes that govern consumer privacy are more than able to handle what might come from big data, to the extent that certain companies might misuse the data that they have acquired. Lawyers at the FTC, et cetera, are very savvy and are able to bring enforcement actions where those things come to be. To John's point about the trade-off that's been made, I do think that there is something new here under the sun. It's sort of like a rap sheet, right? If someone were to take the trouble to go to all the jurisdictions in which I've been arrested, they would be able to piece together all the misdeeds that I committed in my youth. But if someone were just to call up the FBI and ask for my rap sheet, well, that rap sheet is something different. Right? That's an aggregation of all of my misdeeds. It gives you a radically different picture. Even though all my various arrests are publicly available, that rap sheet is something new, it's something different. And big data is a lot like that. It's something new and something different. In the era of small data, we would have said, look, you made a deal with Target when you shopped there, and they figured out you were pregnant, so sorry. But in the era of big data, when we're dealing with new information that's created, I think there are fundamental reasons to be concerned.
I would love to see your rap sheet. Would that disqualify him from the program?
You work for Google. You probably have.
Yeah.
I'm going to do a search after the discussion.
Yeah, easy to find from your computers.
Yes. So I think the privacy thing is very real, and there's lots of big data examples, little data examples. But when we're thinking about getting around that, not making some of the mistakes, what are some of the best practices around big data that people can start to think about as we move forward in this new normal world? Caralynn, do you want to? touch on that?
Sure, and I'll actually piggyback on a little bit of what Nirav said as well, because I think you're starting to bring up a point. So we've talked about aggregating all this data, and it requires there's a new challenge related to interoperability that becomes that now exists, because maybe San Antonio doesn't talk to Boston, which doesn't talk to Detroit, and now we can't aggregate that data in a way that's actually meaningful because the systems are disparate. And so we've got lots of information on lots of different systems, and how do we start bringing them together? And I think this is where some of the best practices can come in. We can start analyzing, again, back to our use of analytical tools, analyzing ways of figuring out, well, what is the right data that we need to capture, and being able to focus on data sets that actually are meaningful. Because there's, in some ways, this goes back to the little data piece as well. It may not be that there's 1,000 factors that figure out that, your train's coming on time. It might just be 2 or 3. And so figuring out how do we narrow in as quickly as possible on what are those 2 and 3, and then that's where our resources get deployed. And so I think in the case of cities, what we have seen is that there is kind of this low-hanging fruit, and then there's the more robust problems. I talked a couple times about the train tracker, the CTA trackers that are available for us. That's really great, but now let's move into traffic. And that becomes a much different problem, because now we're talking about roads that are owned by different municipalities, maybe federal, maybe state, maybe they are local. You're talking about the conditions of those roads, what types of vehicles are on those. There might be cell phones in a number of those vehicles, but as we learned in Boston, maybe we're not using the same sensing techniques in all of them. Mm-hmm. So now you're dealing with these massive amounts of data that all need to make sense to be able to think about the movement of traffic, the movement of people and goods and cars, and that's a much bigger problem than figuring out if your bus is going to be there on time. And so by being able to figure out what are the important pieces of data early on, that allows us to start overcoming some of those challenges, and using some of the analytical tools like high-performance computing that are available to us allow us to start getting at that kind of low-hanging fruit, be able to actually be able to implement solutions.
So John, in 2011 you wrote, "Too few leaders fully understand big data's potential in their businesses, or maybe in this case cities." I added that cities part. "The data assets and liabilities of those businesses or the strategic choices they must make to start exploiting big data. By focusing on these issues, senior executives can help their organizations build a data-driven competitive edge." So that was only 3 years ago, but is this more important than ever?
It's more important than ever, and unfortunately, the world has moved about yay far in those 3 years. The culture of taking data-driven decisions, whether that being used little data or big data, still has a long way to go. And I'm talking about both corporate America as well as the civic or the municipal government world. Now, it's moving, but yes, I think that statement still holds true today. If you get this right, you actually have a competitive advantage. And there are not many of those going around. So whether you're a city competing for businesses or for citizens in a way, which all cities are, or if you're a business competing for revenues, this can be a competitive advantage if you get it right.
Are there 1 or 2 things that can help accelerate the pace at for businesses and cities, how this is being embraced and taken advantage of?
So I think I would tie back to one of your recommendations, but tweak it a little bit, which was your lead from the top, or whatever the phrase was. But I think it's important to lead from the top and make it a priority to open up the data, et cetera. But I think the single biggest thing that companies and municipalities can do is to encourage the innovation from the bottom. Because the CEO or the mayor is not going to know what to do. They're not close enough to the front line, they're not close enough to the data. What you have to do to enable that information to be available to the folks at the front line, who will then create apps, they'll create businesses out of that information. So I would say lead from the top in making it a priority, and then explode the data out as far as you can, and allow the innovation to happen.
Well, that's good to hear, because it sounds like Chicago's doing a lot of both of those things, so a great future ahead for us. So I think Molly's going to come up, and she was going to do some Q&A with you all in the audience.
Thank you. That was a great discussion, and I have a feeling we could be here for 3 more hours continuing this. I'm Molly O'Donnell. I have the pleasure of being the director of the Emerging Leaders Program. So let's open it up for Q&A. We have people around the room with microphones, so wait till that microphone arrives. Right here in the green shirt.
Thanks. Great panel discussion. So if organizations are not making data-driven decisions, how does that get encouraged? Is it just when they start losing, all of a sudden they figure it out? And then how does smaller organizations, smaller cities, people in the not-for-profit arena, can they participate in this, or does this really, because of scale and the cost of mining the data, is it really just for the big boys?
I'm happy to take the first part. So I work at Google, and literally internally at Google, people don't say "I think." People will say "the data suggests." It's not awful.
Not to say they don't think as well.
Right. They do think as well.
There's a lot of that going on.
Involve a bunch of number crunching. But it's true, because we are fortunate to be in a position where we do have enormous resources available to us. And so when we are thinking about how we help our clients grow at scale, we try to make decisions that are, that are truly based on the data points that we're able to collect. And so we will sit there and crunch the numbers and decide if something makes sense or not, because we're able to do things at such scale. So it really, really helps us in our decision-making process. It becomes sort of black and white. And then we're able to take that information to our clients and to help them make better decisions as well. So for us, it works really well. But I also know that not all businesses are positioned like Google. So there needs to be a little bit more of thinking and creativity, as John was talking about with Steve Jobs. It wasn't that he was this brilliant engineer, it's that he really was able to see the whole picture. So for us it works, but that might not be the case for everyone.
I'll just add a bit onto that in terms of how do the smaller cities, or how do nonprofits or smaller businesses take advantage of these opportunities. There's actually a lot of, as John said, we've just scratched the surface in terms of being able to take advantage of big data. And there are a number of sources of investment from nonprofit associations, from large foundations, from the federal government, to be able to figure out how, to arm people, empower them to be able to use big data in unique ways. And so, one might even argue that small cities are at an advantage. There's a smaller amount of data. There is a smaller geography to, want to empower. There's some local cities in and around Chicago, Oak Park being one of them, that is doing some interesting things with smart grids. I'm not the expert, but if anyone in our class wants to stand up and remark on that, please let me know. But they're looking at how do we look at energy utilization on a home-by-home basis, and you can do that in a smaller environment. Within a large city, you may have to do it in a couple neighborhoods, or look at a pilot phase. Within a small city, you might be able to actually look at the city in its aggregate. And so there are some opportunities that smaller cities might have that are actually different.
Right here in the third row.
Oh. I've worked with a lot of companies that utilize data, small, big, whatever. And one of my clients is with GE, and he just told me that his newest project is monetizing all the big data for Cincinnati. So I'm really concerned about the notion of monetizing big data, and I'm also concerned about the notion that, I can't remember which one of you brought this up, but in cooperation between various players, especially in Chicago. I was privileged enough to host an On the Table through Community Trust a couple of weeks ago, maybe it's even 2 months ago now. And I had some unbelievable leaders at my house, young people who had MBAs from Harvard and were running all these different organizations, and my little table got mentioned in national press, and it was really interesting. But every single one of these young people talked about the lack of cooperation between Chicago's various agencies, entities, governmental, corporate, everything. That's pretty frightening. Pretty backwards, too. So what do you all think about that?
Caralynn, could you comment on how bad the city of Chicago is?
Careful.
No. So I'll start with your monetizing question, because I think it's interesting, because I think you're right. There's a perception that can be, this is all mercenary. But I'll give you an example in Chicago of how we're monetizing big data, but with a twist. I mean, some of you tonight may have looked for parking on your way over here, and you maybe went on your phone and you looked at ParkWiz or Spot Hero, and you said, oh, there's a parking lot down there, and for $7 I can go ahead and park my car. That's a big data monetization. It's not causing any harm, and hopefully helping us find parking a little bit cheaper and a little bit easier around the city. Uber is a big data application. Airbnb. These are companies that have been able to make our lives easier, yes, while profiting quite a bit, but being able to use big data. And in those cases that I just mentioned, big data that's coming off of city applications. And so, this goes back to the question we talked about earlier. In a case of limited resources, how can we arm the private sector to take our big data and do something with it that's still helping us, still benefiting us, making our lives easier as citizens, but at the same time, they get something out of it too. They get an ROI. And I just have to make one small comment to your second point. Perhaps I'm coming from a unique situation, so I'll invite my other panelists to comment on this, but with what we're trying to do within UI Labs, which is a nonprofit organization about bringing universities and industry and government together kind of in an honest broker platform, we've actually seen incredible cooperation among the various nonprofit and civic organizations and universities and national labs and others. And so I think actually there's quite a lot of momentum in Chicago to work better together, and groups like World Business Chicago and even departments in the city are really promoting this, I think, quite well. So I hope that sentiment will start changing.
If I could, well, no, I don't have anything to add to that.
Spoken like a lord.
There's a gentleman back there in a blue coat.
Nirav, I had a quick question for you, because you're the attorney on the panel, and if we start from the premise that innovation's good, overreaching's good, you spoke about legal regimes being there to offer protections, like the FTC. Is there ever a concern about over-deterrence? And on the other side of that, another legal issue I was wondering, is there any concern about big data being someday used for discriminatory purposes on any number of factors? So
two excellent points. I'll take them in reverse. With respect to discrimination, yes, that's something we should be vigilant of. It's sad to say that our nation does, in fact, have a history of using data to discriminate against people, whether it be with housing or approval of credit and loans, and that's unfortunate. And it's certainly plausible that big data could be used to make class-wide determinations or zip code-wide determinations on who's eligible. I guess my response would be that to the extent that we think that big data is the problem there, we should also think about whether big data is part of the solution. So the very tools that allow bankers, as rapacious as they are, to make these kinds of class-wide claims are also the same ones that allow us to figure out what's going on and combat that. So that's with respect to discrimination. With respect to over-deterrence, we should always be concerned about over-deterrence. The thinking, I assume, is that an overly harsh regime where something like privacy is allowed to be a trump card would deter cities from getting into this space. I think that's got to be balanced with this, and I think that's a particular risk. I'm hopeful, based on my interactions with the FTC and work I've done across the table from them, that they're quite savvy with respect to this balance. And so while it's a concern, it's not one that I think will stymie the flow.
Back over there. Yes.
I know you have to constrain your discussion somewhat, but I'm surprised with two MDs on the panel that you didn't choose to look at public health, because the costs of poor health and health care are such a huge drag on cities. And so I'd love to know how you made that decision and what you see next in that regard.
We were a little afraid someone was going to realize that we had those degrees.
I'm not the MD.
So we did look at public health. So I think it's good that you mentioned it. There were actually a couple of us that were assigned, Jamie and I, were looking into how do we look at public health. And there's some interesting big data uses, using Twitter feeds for outbreaks of disease, or Google searches, for example. I think that actually has predicted some flu outbreaks, and then not predicted others. I mean, there's challenges when I think the interoperability question and the costs associated with it are one of the reasons why we felt that wasn't a place that we could really dive into as part of this report, because there are so many different factors and so many different data systems that are at play when we're talking about how do we make public health decisions. The state and the county and the city departments of public health and around Chicago and Illinois and the Cook County are all looking at innovative ways to put data to use for public health concerns. But I think what we found is that in terms of looking across sectors, it's probably one of the least mature, and its ability to actually make meaningful use out of it.
We did as part of our McKinsey research on big data and where it's going to have impact, I think healthcare was the second largest sector in terms of potential impact. And some of the things that you're seeing in the, not in pure public health, but in the broader sense of healthcare, there's a company called Castlight Health, which just went public, and what they do is they take the data that's now been made available of what does it cost for a particular procedure by doctor, and they make that available in an analytical way to you as a user, as a corporate health plan participant. So you can make choices, somewhat intelligent, and you can debate how great the engine is, but better, more intelligent choices about who's the doctor you want based on some kind of a quality cost trade-off. It's the first time that really has been available to do. So big data should be able to have a substantial impact if we can get over probably some of the really big privacy questions around what we can do with people's information.
Right here in the back row.
So taking back to the point regarding healthcare and kind of the lack of maturity in that space, what role, you talked about how civic leaders, especially mayors, and whether it's governors of certain states or even at a national level, what can leaders do to encourage that interoperability while still preserving that kind of economic development and monetization element? I'll use for an example the kind of Avalier Health and Epic Systems fight that's going on. Should Epic, who's the largest player in the EHR space, join this kind of consortium of interoperability in the EHR space? They've opted not to. They make claims about interoperability on their own. But can civic leaders at all get involved in fights like this, and I won't say it's a fight, but kind of disputes like this, to say, hey, it's better for the common good, it's better for my city, for all of my hospitals to be interoperable? And you guys have all probably worked with civic leaders. How does that work from both a policy side and from a political side?
Maybe this is a place where one of our colleagues might be able to step in, because that is actually something we talked about in our report, and how in the case of energy and energy usage within buildings, it was a mandate. So how can those things actually be done by local leaders? We can make policy changes.
Josh, do you want to handle that? Can we get a microphone?
Give that man a microphone.
So I think that, is this on? All right, fantastic. So I think that the benefit of working through a city is that a mayor, particularly a powerful mayor, has the ability to bring people around the table and slam his fist on the desk. And I can speak from my time at the city when I was with the Department of Environment and Mayor Daley that he was a master at being able to bring people around and say, hey, this is what's best for the city, so let's figure it out together. But the power of being able to bring people to the 5th floor of City Hall certainly should not be underweighed. I think that from a healthcare perspective, you run into a number of other challenges around HIPAA and national regulations and things that are far outside of anything that I understand. But a big part of moving big data in the right direction is bringing people around the table, espousing a vision, and then forcing them through your whatever mechanism you might have to actually figure out a solution. As opposed to having Mayor Emanuel figure out the solution, he can bring people and force them to figure out the solution together.
Right here in the 3rd row, please.
Thank you for the discussion. Seems to me that big data are like the notes in music. True musicians must be able to transform and rise above that to make true music. So how do we make Chicagoans the best musician in the world and also make our children able to read the data and make music out of it?
Wow, that's poetic.
That's a beautiful metaphor. If you would like to write a report on that 70 to 90 pages, we would welcome your thoughts.
I think that I would just build, so I love the analogy. I think it's a great one. Is my point around you can't just teach math, you have to teach the rest, because somebody has to come up with the idea to do the analysis in the first place. Who's going to come up with that idea? Great. If you're great at math, you can tell me what the analysis told you at the end in terms of the math and the numbers and all the rest. But why did you do that in the first place? Why did you do that analysis? And that's sort of the composer, right? He's got to think about what is he really trying to do with this piece? What is the analysis goal at the end of the day? And so if we lose the ability to think creatively, and we just focus on STEM as, you know, okay, we're gonna drill you in math, and you're gonna know everything there is to know about your numbers. We will lose the ability to think broadly about a problem. And so while I'm a huge supporter of STEM education, I'm also a big supporter of the arts and those kinds of education, because you can't not have both of those pieces coming together. How do we do that? Wow, that's a topic probably for a different panel. I'm the big data guy, not the education guy, but it's a tough question.
EL class of 2015, a little idea.
Yeah, there you go.
I do want to add one point, that it's part of the reason we took on this topic. I remember, in fact, when we were first brainstorming what the topic was, we sat down with Ivo and Rachel and a few others, and we talked about, got some initial feedback, and we realized that there's an awareness piece to this, that part of us building this report and why we felt like we could do it even though we're not at all data experts and not data scientists, was that we thought that one thing we could do is bring awareness to the topic and bring awareness to how it might be able to be used to solve civic problems. And so I don't know, perhaps maybe, you know, we did a little bit of that. I mean, we should start handing these out in grammar schools or something.
Right sure, here. Oh, sorry. Get Shirley up front here.
All right. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't want to hog, but you know, it hasn't been asked, and Ted and John maybe had thought about this a lot, and that is the European Union came through with the ruling that Google misdeeds in their youth could be erased. Mm-hmm. Am I correct? Mm-hmm. And what effect will that have upon the future of security for individuals who want to erase records off of the big data?
Mm-hmm. So it's a much larger and more complicated question than we have time to debate. But what I think the big concern here is, one, nothing on the internet actually gets erased. And once the information that's out there, it's out there. And it's really, really difficult to pull that back. So I think that's a problem. I think trying to decide also what is worth erasing is a huge problem. Someone might want their background erased for one reason, but another person might say, well, that information actually should be part of the public domain. So then it creates this problem around what's erasable. And so much of what, and I'm sure John's got great thoughts on this as well, is that so much of what is happening in today's technological world is so far ahead of the law that it's probably a great time to be a lawyer in technology, because there's a lot to
act for lawyers.
Yeah. There's a lot to figure out, and so I think everyone's moving so far ahead of the laws can't keep up. So all of a sudden the burden rests on a company like Google then to sit here and from scratch figure out how do we take in the influx of requests, how do we decide what needs to be taken down. Is that really even our decision? So it creates a whole host of problems, and I wouldn't be surprised if at some point in the future the ruling is overturned or changed or debated or something, because it's much bigger than the decision they made and Google as a company.
Yeah, and I think that this question around if I chose to put it up, is it erasable? Whereas, the question of I'm walking down the street with my cell phone and I walk into a particular store. Okay, well, I didn't approve that you knew where I was walking into. But that's part of the record now, because the phones are all connected back and the phone company knows exactly where you are. And not only does the phone company know, there's a whole bunch of other companies because you happen to have an app that's open on your phone. Did I really approve you to know that I walked into that store? Well, that's something that I think the government can and probably will come down on, in terms of I didn't actually approve that particular part of the public record. And how do I expunge that part? Not, I happened to take a picture with a beer in my hand when I was in college and I don't want that online anymore.
Come over here to Alan Matthews, please.
So water is a public utility, electricity is a public utility. What about the internet?
So there's two components of that question. The first is the hardware of the internet itself. No question, that's a public utility. Courts have held that for 75 years. But then is the software and the data element of it. That's a tougher question. There have been a couple of municipal courts that have looked at this, and with respect to the data that the city itself generates, that's a public utility. No question about it. Now, what about the data that GE generates? Right? What about the data that you generate by hopping in your Ford and driving around all these various sensors, right? So dividing what aspect of the public utility it can be clawed back. So the data that you contribute to the grid, can you claw that back? Versus what the city puts out there, how much water is being used, et cetera. No question that that's a public utility. And that's the right development. It's the right way to regulate it.
Let's go back there. There's a gentleman with the blue jacket.
Nirav mentioned earlier that the app that allows people to detect, or allows the cities to detect potholes is something that's really kind of privileged for the people that can afford a smartphone and that can use it. I was struck by the fact that today at the Senate hearings on high-speed trading were a good illustration of how big data is used to unlevel the playing field. That it clearly, high-speed trading, the command of data and command of networks that enables high-speed trading is really favoring certain levels of investors more than others. What's the responsibility of government to kind of correct these kind of imbalances where the use of big data really is driving income disparity and driving polarization?
I'll take a quick stab, but I welcome thoughts from my colleagues. The responsibility of government here is to set guardrails. I don't think, if we did have a big data czar, but either in the city or in DC, I don't think that he or she should be charged with sort of central planning style figuring out where big data should be used. The job of that individual should be to determine where big data should not be used, or in particular where it should not be used to privilege a certain group of people, like, as you say, with high frequency trading. And so I think the proper role there is really to ensure that the participants stay in their lane and don't diverge from that. But I welcome thoughts from colleagues about the role of, I know zero about banking.
I would just say that we have to be really, really careful that we don't regulate innovation. Obviously, if people are taking advantage of other pieces, so for instance in the Senate hearing today, right, if they're using other relationships that they have to give themselves an advantage in using that data, obviously you got problems with that. But if someone invests in creating a better algorithm, in using data more effectively, I think we got to be real careful before we start regulating that person, because that's what's going to create the next generation, and the next generation pretty soon, everybody using, I'm using the banking example, right? Everybody using E-Trade will be able to have that kind of advancement. And so I agree we have to be, we don't want to get into a situation where that drives a significant amount of income inequality, but by the same token, we got to make sure that we allow for that innovative guy in California like Larry Page to come up with Google. So it's just a balancing act that I would encourage us to think about.
We have time for just one more question, so let's go right here with the blue sweater.
So we've talked a little bit about little data and innovation, and you don't really know, and the fact that data has been collected for a long period of time, you don't really know what little bits of data from years ago might be useful to innovators in the future. To what degree are we preserving these trillions of bits of data so that people 10 or 50 years from now will also be able to know what was going on in the world today?
You want to take that from Google's point of view? Everything is safe.
Yeah. I mean, they now know the temperature of your house.
Yes, we do. So, in the beginning, about 15 years ago, Larry Page and Sergey Brin had the idea to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And they've really come a long way in trying to realize that dream. And when they came up with it, they meant it. And there is still a long, long way to go. It'll probably never actually ever be realized because of, new information is coming out every day, and you have information in your head. How are we going to get that and put it into a computer? But the idea that the world's information is being, at least online information, is being indexed and stored, I think is actually a really important thing, because it's almost like we're able to, and other people are doing this as well, but like really preserving history so that we can find anything at any time. And so many, many years ago, they started an extremely ambitious program to digitize the world's books. And it's really getting to exactly what you're talking about, is you might have a great hardcover book from many, many years ago that's not online, but it should be, and it should be useful and available to people around the world. So they put together a program where they created machines that could open a book and turn its pages and scan the page and put it into our index and make sense of it all. So there's a lot of projects like that that are underway. Google Street View is another example of that, where we've taken pictures of most of the roads in America and many other countries around the world in an effort to improve mapping technology, to improve directions, to also think about driverless cars. Driverless cars, in some respects, are like a little kid's racetrack where the cars go around the circle. The driverless cars are kind of like that, because they've got all of this information about where they are, and they keep doing it and doing it and doing it, and it's learning and it's getting smarter. So the idea of collecting the world's information, I think, is actually really, really important, and we're trying to do our little part of that.
Great. Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. This was wonderful.